One of the more interesting aspects of toy making, and specifically action figure sales, is the relationship between figures and vehicles. Superheroes, supervillains, galactic warriors, evil giant monsters, heroic saviors, a lot of them have signature vehicles. Batman is probably one of the best examples. Batman and the Batmobile go together like peanut butter and chocolate or Arbor Day and fireworks. You really don't see one without the other. Other characters, the vehicles tend to enhance the play. They might make it more enjoyable, and they create new play patterns. There are characters that have iconic vehicles, but they don't necessarily have to have the vehicle in order to play, collect, enjoy the brand. So what I want to look at is the relationship between figures, vehicles, and how this determines whether or not modern lines, and especially modern collector lines, can exist. Now, obviously, modern collector lines can do very big vehicles. The sail barge is a perfect example of this, although it's a bit more of a dollhouse in the shape of a sail barge. But the idea of putting a figure behind the cockpit, I've talked about this in quite a few videos, and with Star Wars in particular as a brand, this is really the key to its success, was the interaction between vehicle and figure. Obviously, there are people who just collect the figures, and this was a big part of the hobby going all the way back to the 80s. But if you look at a lot of the material that Kenner back in the day used to promote the Star Wars line, it was very heavy on the play sets and the vehicles. The figures were really considered a secondary purchase that you might pick up after you got the vehicle. The vehicle was thought of as the star, if you will, of the movie. Obviously, things changed a little bit, and the figures themselves became the toy everyone wanted to own. But that vehicle-figure relationship is very important. If you contrast that with something like, say, Ninja Turtles, which, while there are vehicles in Ninja Turtles, they're not as dependent on vehicles. Other brands, well, like Transformers, the characters are vehicles. So you can start to see how vehicle and figure play tends to go hand in hand with action figures. The ability to put a figure behind the wheel or in the cockpit, whatever it is, definitely affects the playability. And brands like Ninja Turtles that aren't as dependent on vehicles tend to get more and more collector SKUs for the adult. Same thing with Thundercats. Lion-O, yes, there is a Thunder Tank, and there are vehicles for the Thundercats. But unlike Star Wars, unlike the Batmobile, the character isn't dependent on the vehicle. If there was no Thunder Tank, if Super 7 never made this, you could still collect Thundercats figures and still have a very enjoyable shelf. And hey, if you're a kid and you were lucky enough to have these figures, meaning the Super 7 figures, or the vintage figures, you could still enjoy them. Same with the Party Wagon, with the Ninja Turtles. It's awesome that we're going to get a Party Wagon. It's very, very cool. And the Party Wagon is, you know, the Turtles' signature car around town. But in no way is it a sort of end-all, be-all of their play pattern. Unlike something like, say, Dino Riders. Let's talk about Dino Riders for a moment. One of my favorite brands that just has not been on the shelf in decades. So, the dinosaurs in this brand are basically the vehicles. I mean, they have missiles and jets and exhaust ports and all that strapped onto them. So whether you're going to go with animal or vehicle, it really is a hybrid. But the point is, the dinosaurs in Dino Riders are the vehicles, you know, just as much as the Millennium Falcon or the X-Wing. The characters alone, without the dinosaurs, you really don't have a brand. You just have these, you know, sci-fi characters with cool weapons, and, you know, how is that different than any other brand? It's the dinosaurs that make Dino Riders unique. And because of this dependency on vehicles / ride-ons or, you know, larger items that interact with the figures, this is why a brand like Dino Riders has a very hard time coming back. Because you can't just tool up and issue figures. You have to have an entire play pattern. And with Dino Riders, while the Dino Riders concept would be an amazing movie, I mean, why this hasn't happened, I don't know. But that's what holds it back, is you can't just produce figures. You have to produce a whole world for this particular brand to work. And as cool as the characters are, it was the dinosaurs that really made it. You probably can't name too many of the characters, but the dinosaurs are recognizable, even if you're just referring to them as T-Rex or a Triceratops or a Stegosaurus, etc., etc. And visually, they have this, what's called toyetic elements. There's projectiles, and there's parts that, you know, move and articulate on the dinosaurs. Another example in the same vein is Sectars. Another line that I actually tried really hard to bring back at a few companies, and again, the issue that we kept hitting, the roadblock, was that while the characters themselves, easily recognizable, good versus evil, you put those in front of a kid, someone who doesn't know the brand, and they're probably going to be able to tell you who's the heroic warrior and who's the evil warrior, just based on color schemes. But again, while the characters are visually very cool and they have iconic looks, such as the antennae coming out of their forehead, so you could recognize them as Sectar characters, they're very dependent, much like Dino Riders, on their rides. In this case, Sectars are not riding around on dinosaurs, but rather on giant bugs, and we all know that the only thing cooler than a dinosaur is a giant insect. So, yeah, I'd like to see that crossover happen. Make it happen. What, Hasbro, Mattel, some other toy company? So, same issue here. The obstacle that keeps a line from Sectars from being re-released, either for kids or collectors in our modern times, is the dependence on vehicles. You can't just do a collector line of really cool Sectar action figures. I mean, you could. I mean, I would definitely buy some. But in order to sell it at retail, in a store, you need the vehicles. In this case, they were actually puppets, which makes them even cooler, because the only thing cooler than an insect is an insect puppet. And much like the dinosaurs in Dino Riders, you have to have the insects, the giant ride-on, in order to actually enjoy and play out this property. You could obviously display figures on your shelf, just like you do Marvel Legends or Star Wars Black Series or any number of figure-based lines. But for a kid to really get into it, well, you need all of the SKUs that you had back in the vintage era, and this included very large plastic and plush puppets that you could strap the figures to, and you'd put your hand inside and wiggle all of the insects' arms and legs around, and it was a very cool feature. But again, because you're dependent on a ride-on, on a vehicle, in order to make this line merchandisable and, if you will, work for retail, that's the factor that holds this up. A last example is Mask. This is another line that fans have asked for, why can't Hasbro bring Mask back? And while there are some issues that they deliberately keep it off the shelf in order to not cannibalize G.I. Joe sales because of the similarity, Mask, much like Dino Riders and Sectars, is a line that is dependent on ride-ons, in this case actual vehicles, as opposed to creatures like the giant insects or the giant dinosaurs. Sure, you could put out a Matt Trask action figure and he could have his mask and all of that. But if he doesn't have his transforming vehicle, well, now you really basically just have a military guy with a mask on. You need the vehicles in order to play out Mask. Their transformation, the way the characters in this IP link to the vehicles through their masks, and there's sort of a combining part there. Obviously, there has been a Matt Trask action figure that was released in G.I. Joe, but he didn't get this vehicle. None of the vehicles came out. They just tried one figure, because a figure alone isn't enough with these lines. Many of these vintage lines from the 80s, the ones we've been talking about for the last few minutes, because of their dependency on larger, higher price point SKUs, whether they're vehicles or dinosaurs or whatever, the inherent DNA of the property, its reason for being, requires figure and vehicle play. Unlike something like where, Iron Man just has Iron Man's car, well, that's just creating a car to have more fun with Iron Man. When you think of Iron Man, you don't immediately say, oh, he needs his vehicle. Star Wars in the modern times has absolutely latched onto this and realized how much the success of the figure-vehicle combo played into the original line in the 80s. So their Mission Fleet series, or subline that's out now, which is very kid-friendly, is essentially a figure-vehicle-based line with projectiles and all sorts of kid-friendly features. While collectors may not be as hot on this line, it's doing very well with kids because, well, being able to pilot a ship is inherent to Star Wars play. One of the reasons we don't see this in things like the vintage line for collectors is the expense. An X-Wing these days costs over $100 at retail for the vintage series. And that factor, that cost, is what keeps it off shelf and what's preventing the vintage line from having more vehicles. So that tends to be the importance of having vehicles in line when they are actually part of the play pattern. Yes, He-Man could absolutely fight without Battle Cat. Does Battle Cat make him cooler? Absolutely, but he's not required. You don't have to have a Battle Cat in order to enjoy He-Man. But a Matt Trask figure without his transforming car, that's a whole other issue, and that's the main reason why these lines don't get a shot at retail. I hope this video clarified the relationship between vehicles and figures in certain lines, and why certain lines are more dependent on vehicles and ride-ons than others. Boy, I'd love to see some of these lines come back. Any lines that I missed? Are there vehicle-based lines from your childhood that also needed to make a comeback, even if you had to tool up all of those vehicles to complete the play pattern? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.